The Ohio State Reformatory, located in Mansfield, Ohio, opened its doors to its first inmates in 1896. It was intended to be an intermediate penitentiary where young, first-time, and nonviolent offenders could be counseled and reformed. The goal was to rehabilitate them so that once they were released, they would not return to a life of crime. Boys as young as 13 years of age were admitted here. It differed from the prison system by the nature that punishment was not the focus. In fact, inmates spent most of their time outside of their cells and typically would only be behind bars during sleeping hours. During most of their sentence, they would be involved in gym activities, technical and trade schooling, counseling, and regular chapel services. The intimidating design of the building was inspired with the intent to put the sense of dread into the young criminals who approached for their confinement. It is a combination of Queen Anne, Victorian Gothic, and Richardson Romanesque architecture styles. At 250,000 square feet, it has 6 tiers of cells. For comparison, most prisons have only 3 or 4. It actually holds the Guinness Book's record as having the tallest freestanding steel cell block in the world. In pop culture, the reformatory is most famous as being known as Shawshank Prison, as it was the primary filming site for the movie The Shawshank Redemption, and it still houses some props from the film. It was also used in Lil Wayne's music video Go DJ in 2004. In its beginnings, it seemed to be successful in its intended purpose. Sadly, a series of tragic events would quickly lead to its deterioration as a reformatory. In 1930, there was a fire at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus, Ohio. Having nowhere else to house the prisoners who were incarcerated there, they moved them to the reformatory, which was built to house 1,000 inmates at the time, but ended up housing 3,000 at its height. Young boys who had had minor violations were forced into being housed with hardened, dangerous criminals who had records of violence and even murder. The cells, 8 by 5 feet wide, were designed to only hold 2 people, but they were crowded into containing 4. The inmates were also now forced to spend 23 hours a day in those cells. The overcrowding led to deplorable conditions. Giant rats and cockroaches started to overrun the prison as they made their way through the drain system and into the cells of the inmates. The inmates started shoving anything they could get a hold of into the toilets to try to prevent them from getting in, and in their ears and nose to try to prevent the roaches from crawling into their orifices. There was no heating system, and the building would reach bitter cold temperatures in the winter, to the point that frost would form on the walls and floors, and the toilet water would freeze. The showers were referred to as the car wash. Essentially, the imprisoned would strip down and form a line, walking a trail of water sprayers and scrubbing their bodies as they walked, as there was no time or space to allow for proper showers. By 1970, it was considered a high-security prison that experienced multiple riots, brutal inmate-on-inmate and inmate-on-guard violence, murders, and prisoners who took their own lives. At one point, the inmates were lighting fires so regularly that the warden said to let them burn it, They can put it out themselves or burn. After one riot, 120 people were crammed into just 20 solitary confinement cells for 30 days. At least 215 inmates and 2 guards died there throughout its time as a prison. One of the most horrific events that occurred here was the death of James Lockhart. James was a 22-year-old that received a sentence of 15 years. When he reached his parole hearing, his parole was denied. He was so adverse to spending any more time there that he actually set himself on fire inside of his cell and burned to death. Fellow inmates divulged that they would never be able to get his screams and the smell of his burning flesh out of their minds. His skin was melted to the prison floor and had to be scraped away. Another man, 18-year-old Larry Harmer, only got a 1 to 5 year sentence, but killed himself by hanging from a bedsheet. Inmates were known to go into cells together, with only one coming back out. The other found murdered and stuffed under the bed. One feud between 2 inmates ended in the barber's chair, when one inmate slit the other's throat with a straight razor. In total, there were an estimated 278 inmate-on-inmate killings within the facility. Most who died there were buried in a cemetery behind the prison and labeled not with their name, but by the number assigned to them at the time of their incarceration. The series of tragic deaths that occurred here even involved employees of the reformatory. In 1932, Frank Hanger, a guard working in solitary confinement, was murdered by 2 inmates when they hit him over the head with an iron bar. Helen Gladkey, the wife of the warden Art Gladkey, met an accidental death in 1950 in the closet of their living quarters. While getting ready for church, she reached up to get something from the shelf of the closet when her husband's handgun fell and discharged, shooting her in the chest. Then, in 1959, Art died in his office after suffering a heart attack. Its days as a prison ultimately ended after prisoners sued and won the lawsuit under the ruling of inhumane living conditions. The last inmates left the building on December 31st, 1990. Paranormal accounts from this massive location include shadow figures walking the halls or peeking out from the cells, disembodied voices, orbs of light, the sound of keys rattling, perhaps the murdered guard Frank Hanger, and visitors to the building who are pushed or even scratched. The smell of Helen's rose-scented perfume and Art's cherry pipe tobacco can sometimes be detected in the warden's living quarters. Though no one was ever executed inside of the reformatory, the reformatory does house the electric chair known as Old Sparky that once resided at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. 315 men were executed in that chair, including the inmates that killed the guard Frank Hanger. It is believed that the chair has souls of some of those men still attached to it, adding to the building's haunted activity. Though the entire building seems to be a hotbed for the paranormal, some of the most active locations include the West Attic. When the Ohio State Pen burned down in 1930, the West Attic was where they housed its most dangerous, violent criminals, and murderers. Approximately 300 inmates were placed into the room, without beds, without anything to separate them, and with only one guard. As such, some of the most violent inmate-on-inmate brutality occurred there, and some men never emerged from the attic, losing their lives to murder. Paranormal accounts in this area of the prison include shadow figures and unexplained balls of light. And energy here is known to get aggressive at times, particularly with women, resulting in their clothes or hair being yanked. East Cell Block. This is the cell block in which James Lockhart set himself on fire. It is also where some of the most dangerous inmates were housed, including those on death row. Known as the Jungle, its motto was, "Kill first and ask questions later." Solitary confinement. This includes the sub-basement, which is the basement below solitary. Those in solitary were subjected to a punishment called 8 and 8. They would be forced to stand for 8 hours and then lay for 8 hours, all while being chained. This was done over and over again until they were released or until they died. The sub-basement contained an area called the Hole, which actually was a hole in the ground. And yes, inmates were put in there. 2 inmates had the misfortune of being in there during a heavy rainstorm. The hole filled with water, and they both drowned. Join me on YouTube in my paranormal investigation videos from the Ohio State Reformatory as I spend time in all of these very haunted locations alone.